They say silence can break a man. But that day, silence didn't break anyone. It built something. It built a miracle. 50 people stood in a county courthouse, their boots tracing dust across the linoleum floors, their faces solemn, their eyes all fixed on the same thing. A small white house at the edge of Maple Creek Road. On that day, not one of them spoke. Not one of them lifted a hand. Not one of them dared to breathe too loud. And because of that silence, that strange, heavy, defiant silence, a woman named Laura Jensen got her home back for just $1. No one ever forgot that day. Not the sheriff who presided over it. Not the auctioneer who hesitated mid-sentence. And certainly not Laura, who would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how a single quiet moment could echo louder than 1,000 acts of charity. But the story didn't start in that courthouse. It started with a knock. 3 months earlier, in the small town of Ridgway, Kansas, population 1,200 and shrinking, Laura Jensen had been standing at her kitchen sink, watching the first snow of the year fall across the soybean fields. The light was thin, gray, the kind of winter morning that made the world look fragile and far away. She was 43, recently widowed, and living in the only home she and her late husband, Mark, had ever owned. A simple one-story farmhouse, chipped white paint, sagging porch, the kind of place where every floorboard had a story. The knock startled her. It wasn't loud, but it had weight to it. 3 deliberate taps. When she opened the door, a man in a heavy brown coat stood on her porch holding an envelope. His car idled behind him, a dark sedan with county plates. "Mrs. Jensen?" he asked, eyes downcast. "Yes," she said, clutching her sweater tighter. He handed her the envelope. "I'm afraid this is official notice from the county." She didn't open it right away. Somehow she already knew. The man nodded once, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's about the mortgage." After he left, she stood in the doorway for a long time, the letter unopened in her hand, the wind blowing snow into the house. When she finally tore it open, her eyes caught the words that changed everything. Notice of foreclosure. Property to be sold at public auction. She sat down on the floor, surrounded by unpaid bills, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. She whispered to the empty kitchen, "Mark, I can't do this without you." But Mark was gone. A heart attack 2 winters before. The insurance money had kept her afloat for a while, but between medical bills, funeral costs, and a bad season on the farm, the math had stopped working. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was 20 years of her life. The swing Mark had built for their daughter, the pencil marks on the doorframe measuring birthdays, the worn spot on the porch where her dog, Buddy, used to sleep. Now all of it had a price tag. Word spread fast in Ridgway. News like that always did. At the diner, people lowered their voices when she walked in. At church, neighbors offered gentle smiles, the kind that tried to be kind but only reminded her that everyone knew. One person who didn't lower his voice was Eddie Moore, her next-door neighbor, 65, gruff, retired steelworker, known for his quick temper and his habit of fixing everything with duct tape. Eddie had been Mark's fishing buddy for 20 years, and after Mark's death, he'd quietly taken over mowing Laura's lawn every Sunday morning. He came by that night with a thermos of coffee and a look of someone who'd been thinking hard. "They can't just take your house, Laura." "They can," she said softly, looking at the notice on the table. "They will." He frowned, rubbing his chin. "You've been here your whole life. Everyone in town knows this house. They can't let that happen." "Everyone's got their own troubles, Eddie." He didn't answer. He just stared at the papers on the table, jaw tightening. Over the next few weeks, Laura tried everything. She talked to the bank. She applied for a hardship extension. She even called her late husband's old employer, hoping there might be some unclaimed pension. Nothing. The auction was set for March 3rd. As the date crept closer, the town's conversations began to circle around it. You could hear it at the hardware store, at the gas station, whispered between pews on Sunday mornings. Some people said it was a shame. Others said that's just how things go. But a few, a small, quiet few, started wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something they could do. One of them was Eddie. Another was Pastor Grant from the local church. And another was a single mother named Rosa Delgado, who worked nights at the diner and owed Laura more than one favor. They met one evening in the church basement, the smell of coffee and old hymn books hanging in the air. "We can't outbid the investors," Pastor Grant said, hands folded on the table. "The bank's asking price starts at $120,000. Even if we pooled our savings, we wouldn't touch that." "So what do we do?" Rosa asked. "Just watch her lose everything?" Eddie leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "What if nobody bids?" The room went quiet. "Excuse me?" the pastor said. "I mean it," Eddie continued. "What if not one of us makes a bid? The bank can't drive the price up by itself. They start at 120, right? But if nobody bites, if it stalls out, the auctioneer has to drop it. They'll call for a lower opening. And then what?" Eddie shrugged. "Maybe they drop it again. Maybe it goes low enough that she can buy it back herself. Maybe $1. I've seen stranger things." Pastor Grant stared at him. "That would take everyone's cooperation." "Yeah," Eddie said, sipping his coffee. 50 people, maybe more. Every neighbor, every farmer, everyone who's got a reason to care about decency. They'd all have to stay silent." Rosa smiled faintly. 50 people staying quiet. In this town, that might be the miracle right there. But they started calling. One by one, they told the story. They spoke of what Laura had done for them, the meals she'd cooked after funerals, the nights she'd sat in hospital waiting rooms, the time she'd watched other people's kids so they could work double shifts. By the end of the week, word had spread far beyond Ridgeway. Folks from 2 towns over were whispering about the plan. No one knew if it would work. No one even knew if it was legal. But it felt right. March 3rd came cold and windy, the kind of day where the air itself felt nervous. The courthouse was packed. Farmers in dusty boots, teachers, shop owners, retirees, maybe 50 people in all. The auctioneer, a tall man in a brown hat, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. "Lot number 12, he announced, his voice echoing off the walls. "One single-family home, 412 Maple Creek Road. Starting bid, $120,000. And that's when the miracle began. He looked around the room, waiting for a hand to rise. None did. 120, he said again. "Do I hear 120? Nothing. Just the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights." The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably. "All right then, 110? Still nothing." Eddie glanced across the room and caught the eyes of half a dozen people. Silent nods passing like invisible signals. "Okay," the auctioneer said, a nervous chuckle escaping him. 90,000? Silence. He looked to the back of the room, where Laura sat alone, hands clasped tight, tears in her eyes. She didn't know what was happening yet. The auctioneer wiped his brow. 50,000? The sheriff leaned toward him. "Drop it to 1,000. See if that shakes something loose." $1,000, the auctioneer said. "Do I hear 1,000? A cough, a shuffle, the squeak of a chair, but no bids. By now, his voice was cracking. "All right, folks, let's make this quick. 500? 100? 50? Eddie's heart was pounding. He'd never prayed so hard in his life. The auctioneer hesitated, looked at Laura, then down at his clipboard. Opening bid, $1. And then, before anyone else could move, a soft voice from the back of the room said, "I'll take it." It was Laura. The gavel came down like thunder. "Sold," the auctioneer said, voice trembling. "Sold for $1. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the sheriff removed his hat. Someone started clapping, and soon the whole room erupted. Not with cheers, not with noise, but with something deeper. It was the sound of people exhaling the breath they'd been holding for months. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the courthouse steps in white. And for the first time in a long time, Ridgeway felt like home again. When the gavel's echo faded, it left behind a silence that felt different from the one before. Before, it had been tense, uncertain, a silence of fear. Now it was sacred. People stood there in stunned stillness, unsure whether to clap or cry or simply breathe. It was as if everyone in that courthouse understood they had just witnessed something that didn't happen anymore, something almost biblical in its simplicity. Laura sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap. The auctioneer cleared his throat, still visibly shaken. He looked at her, then at the crowd, then back again and whispered, "Ma'am, I suppose it's yours." A murmur ran through the room, part laughter, part relief, part disbelief. Eddie was the first to move. He crossed the floor, slow but certain, the heels of his boots clicking like punctuation marks. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. He just placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, tears streaming freely now. "Eddie, what did you do?" He shook his head. "Not just me." He looked around the room, at Rosa, at Pastor Grant, at the faces of 50 people who had just proven that compassion could be louder than greed. "All of us." Someone laughed softly. Another person started clapping again, and soon the whole room was filled with the sound of hands. A slow, steady rhythm, not for victory, but for faith. When Laura walked out of that courthouse, the snow had stopped. The air was bright, clear, the kind that makes your lungs sting and your heart feel awake. Outside, reporters had gathered. Word had spread faster than anyone imagined. A young journalist from the Topeka Herald stepped forward, microphone shaking in her hand. "Mrs. Jensen, how does it feel to have your home back?" Laura blinked at the cameras, dazed. "I don't know," she said softly. "I think it's going to take a while to believe it's real." Eddie stepped between her and the crowd, his voice firm but kind. "She doesn't need questions. She needs to go home." And so she did. That afternoon, the town of Ridgeway was different. You could feel it in the air, in the way people lingered outside the diner, in the way strangers smiled when they passed each other on the sidewalk. For once, gossip had been replaced by pride. At the post office, old Mrs. Chandler, who'd lived through the Dust Bowl, told anyone who'd listen, "I haven't seen anything like this since the war. People caring for people again. Maybe there's hope yet." That night, the phone at Laura's house rang so much she finally took it off the hook. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles, pies, envelopes of small bills, just to help fix the porch, they'd say. Someone even left a new mailbox, hand-painted with her name, sitting quietly on the front steps. But what struck Laura most wasn't the money, or the gifts, or the kindness. It was the silence, the kind of respectful, knowing silence that followed her wherever she went. Not pity, not curiosity, just quiet recognition. People smiled, tipped their hats, and said nothing. They didn't need to. By morning, her story had made the front page of the Topeka Herald, then the Kansas City Star, then the Evening News. "Small Town Silent Auction Saves Widow's Home," the headline read. The reporter who'd first covered it came back for a follow-up interview. "Did you expect this reaction?" she asked. Laura smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "No," she said, "but maybe we've all been waiting for a story like this. Something that reminds us who we still are." Eddie refused to speak to the cameras. Rosa did one interview, but only because she thought it might help the diner. Pastor Grant gave a statement that made half the congregation cry on Sunday morning. "Sometimes," he said from the pulpit, "the most powerful prayer isn't the one you speak, it's the one you live." In the weeks that followed, donations began to arrive from all over the country. Some were small, $5, $10, others much larger. A letter from Oregon came with a check for $10,000 and a note that read, "For the town that remembered how to be human." With the money, the community decided to create something lasting, something that would turn one act of silence into a legacy. They called it the Maple Creek Fund. Its purpose was simple: to help local families at risk of losing their homes. Eddie was put in charge, though he protested at first. "I'm no banker," he said. "You're honest," Laura replied. "That's good enough." By spring, the snow melted, and Ridgeway bloomed like it hadn't in years. People painted fences, reopened old shops, and started planting gardens again. The diner added 2 new tables. The school hired back its art teacher. The town had found its heartbeat again. Quiet, steady, hopeful. Sometimes Laura would sit on her porch, coffee in hand, and watch the sun set over the fields. Every now and then, a stranger would stop by, curious to see the house from the story. She always welcomed them in, gave them pie, and told them about the people who stayed silent. "They didn't just save my home," she'd say. "They saved each other." One evening, as the fireflies began to appear, she found Eddie sitting on the porch rail, staring at the horizon. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "Never thought silence could feel that loud." She smiled. "It's funny, isn't it? How something so small can change everything." He nodded. "Yeah, but it only works when people remember it's not about one person. It's about all of us." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "So how do we make sure people remember?" Eddie grinned. That same mischievous spark Mark had once loved him for. "Guess we find someone else who needs a miracle." And that's how it began again. The first person they helped was an older couple from the next county over. The husband had fallen behind on his mortgage after his wife's surgery. Their farm was headed to auction. So, on the morning of April 17th, 50 people from Ridgeway climbed into their trucks and drove an hour east. When the bidding started, the auctioneer looked out at a crowd full of familiar faces. Quiet, calm, patient. And when the opening bid came, no one spoke. Not one word. By the end of the day, another home had been saved. It wasn't long before the media caught on again. The silence movement, they called it this time. Letters poured in from towns across America, from Ohio, Montana, Texas, all telling their own versions of the same miracle. In one small town, people refused to bid on a family grocery store. In another, a group of veterans stayed silent so a fellow soldier could keep his mechanic shop. It was spreading, not as protest, not as rebellion, but as quiet defiance against a world that had forgotten how to care. Laura watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She never planned to be the face of anything. She just wanted her house. But somehow, her small act of desperation had become a blueprint for kindness. One night, as rain pattered softly against the windows, she sat at her kitchen table, writing a letter to her daughter, Emily, who was away at college. She wrote, "Don't ever believe silence means weakness. Sometimes it's the loudest, most beautiful thing in the world. Because silence doesn't need to prove anything. It just needs to stand there, strong and unshakable, until the noise gives up." She folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it beside a small framed photograph of Mark. "See, honey?" she whispered, touching the glass. "They remembered what you taught them, that we belong to each other." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint hum of the town, laughter from the diner, a distant song from the church, and somewhere, the sound of someone hammering nails into a new fence. Life was continuing, quietly, beautifully, and in Ridgeway, Kansas, silence had become more than the absence of sound. It had become a language, one that spoke of loyalty, love, and the kind of hope you can't sell at any auction. By the time summer came to Kansas, the story of Ridgeway had already outgrown Ridgeway. It started with a news feature on a national morning show, a smiling anchor introducing Laura's story as proof that small towns still have big hearts. Then came radio interviews, op-eds, hashtags. Someone created a social media page called the Silence Project, and within a week, it had more followers than the population of the entire county. But none of that felt real to Laura. What felt real were the letters, hundreds of them, handwritten, folded neatly, sometimes stained with tears or coffee. They came from all over. A single mother in Oregon who wrote, "Your story reminded me that my town could care again." A retired coal miner in West Virginia who said, "I didn't have money to give, but I stayed quiet for a neighbor who needed his house more than I did." Laura kept them all in a wooden box on her kitchen table. Every night, she'd open a few and read them out loud, her voice soft in the lamplight, as if the letters were prayers. Eddie teased her for it. "You're gonna need a bigger table," he said one evening. "Then I'll build one," she replied with a smile. The Maple Creek Fund continued to grow. Donations came in faster than anyone could have expected. With Pastor Grant and Rosa managing the accounts, the fund began paying off small debts, medical bills, and overdue mortgages. Each case was reviewed quietly, discreetly, no fanfare, no headlines, just neighbors helping neighbors. But with attention came questions. Some said the silent auctions were unfair, that by refusing to bid, communities were interfering with free markets. Others accused them of orchestrating emotional manipulation. Laura read one of those articles late one night, the words cutting sharper than she expected. Good intentions don't excuse mob behavior. What happens when silence becomes coercion? She shut her laptop and sat in the dark, thinking, had they gone too far? Was silence still kindness if it hurt someone else? A week later, she got her answer, or at least the beginning of one. A man came to her door. He was maybe 50, thin, with tired eyes and a farmer's tan that spoke of long hours under the sun. He introduced himself as Henry Walsh, from a neighboring town called Brenton. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, hat in hand, "I think we need your help." He told her his story, about how his sister, who lived with cerebral palsy, was about to lose the small home their parents had left them. The mortgage company had sold the debt, and an out-of-state buyer was pushing for foreclosure. The auction was in 3 weeks. Laura listened quietly. When he finished, she said, "How many people live in Brenton?" "About 2,000, he said. She smiled. "Then that's 2,000 chances to make a miracle." 3 weeks later, they all drove to Brenton. 50 trucks again, same dusty roads, same determined faces. But this time something was different. The crowd was larger. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters had come from as far as Chicago. The silent auction had become a movement, and people wanted to see if it could happen again. Laura didn't want to be in front, but when she stepped out of her truck, people started clapping. She waved them off, embarrassed. "It's not about me," she said softly. Inside, the auctioneer recognized her immediately. "You're the Ridgeway lady," he said with a half-smile. "Guess I know what's coming." She smiled back. "Maybe, maybe not." The auction began, and just like before, silence filled the room. Only this time it wasn't calm. It was charged like the air before a storm. People watched, waiting to see if it would work. Starting bid, 90,000. The auctioneer called. Nothing. 80. Still nothing. 50. Finally, from the back, a man stood. "This ain't right," he said loudly. "You folks are rigging the system." The room tensed. Laura turned, her voice steady. "No one's forcing you to do anything, sir. You can bid if you want." He hesitated, then sat down. Silence returned. When the gavel finally fell, $1 again. A wave of emotion rolled through the crowd. Henry's sister cried. The reporters cheered. But Laura felt something else. A crack, small, invisible, but there. The silence was spreading faster than anyone could control it, and she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. That night, she and Eddie sat in his garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and old wood. "You see what happened in there?" she said. "That man was angry. Maybe he had a right to be." Eddie shrugged. "Maybe, but we didn't take anything from him. We just didn't play the game." She sighed. "Still feels like we changed the rules." He leaned back in his chair, wiping grease from his hands. "Rules change all the time, Laura. Usually for worse. Maybe it's about time they changed for better." She wanted to believe that. She really did. Weeks passed. The silence movement spread from Kansas to Oklahoma, then to Iowa and Missouri. Every week, a new headline. Another family saved by community silence. One journalist wrote, "It's not a protest, it's a heartbeat." And yet, beneath the headlines, not everyone was celebrating. Banks tightened their policies. Real estate investors started avoiding small-town auctions. State legislators began discussing intervention laws. Through it all, Laura kept to her routine. Mornings on the porch, coffee with Eddie, church on Sundays, and letters, always more letters. One envelope stood out. Came from New York, thick paper, typed neatly. Inside was a formal letter from a man named Thomas Leland, a real estate developer who claimed he'd lost 3 properties because of the silent movement. His words were cold. Your actions have cost me millions. You may think you're saving people, but you're just shifting pain from one family to another. Silence has consequences, Mrs. Jensen. Laura read it twice, then set it aside. She didn't know this man, but his words stuck with her. That night she couldn't sleep. She got up, wrapped herself in a blanket, and stepped outside. The fields stretched under a silver moon, quiet and endless. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn called, lonely and low. She thought about silence, how it had started as an act of mercy, and now it was something larger, heavier. It had changed lives, yes, but maybe it had started to change her too. She whispered into the wind, "What do we owe each other?" The next morning, she called a meeting at the church. Everyone came, Pastor Grant, Rosa, Eddie, half the town. She stood in front of them, her voice clear. "We've done something beautiful," she began. "But we've also done something powerful. And power needs to be careful." People murmured, uneasy. "I don't want this to become a weapon," she continued. "Silence can heal, but it can also hurt. We have to remember why we started. It wasn't to punish anyone. It was to protect each other." Eddie nodded. "Then we make that the rule," he said. "We only stay silent when it saves someone, not when it costs someone else their home." Pastor Grant smiled. "Sounds like scripture to me." They wrote it down that day, not as law but as promise. They called it the Ridgeway Pledge. It read, "We will stay silent only to heal, never to harm. We will use our silence to lift, not to take. And when silence is no longer kindness, we will speak." The pledge spread just like the movement had, quietly, humbly, across towns and states and hearts. And slowly, the noise around them began to settle. The headlines faded. The cameras left. What remained were the stories. Real people, real homes, and a simple belief that community wasn't just where you lived. It was who you chose to stand with. By the first frost of that year, Ridgeway was back to being Ridgeway. Kids walking to school. Farmers fixing fences. Coffee brewing at the diner. But under the surface, something permanent had changed. Silence had become a kind of faith, not in God, not in systems, but in each other. Sometimes, late at night, Laura would still think of the man from New York, of his letter, of his anger. And she'd whisper into the dark, "Maybe you're right. Silence has consequences." Then she'd glance at the photo of her husband, the old house safe and warm around her, and she'd add, "But so does love." Winter came early that year. By November, frost painted the edges of every fence post, and the mornings carried the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch forever. Ridgeway had grown quieter again, but not the way it used to be. It wasn't the silence of fear or loss anymore. It was the peace of a town that had found its rhythm again. Laura had grown quieter too. The years since the auction had been kind to her heart but not to her body. The long hours, the travel, the letters, the meetings, they all took their toll. Her once dark hair had turned silver, her steps slower, her breath shorter on cold mornings. Eddie noticed it first. "You're coughing again," he said one day as he dropped off firewood. "I'm fine," she replied, waving him off. "Fine doesn't sound like that." She smiled faintly. "You ever think maybe I just like attention?" He grinned. "You? Never." But later that night, as she lay awake listening to the wind against the windows, Laura knew the truth she didn't want to say out loud. The doctors had called it heart failure, slow, unpredictable, but certain. She told no one except Pastor Grant. "I don't want people worrying," she'd said. "They've already given me enough." He'd nodded, eyes soft. "You've given them more." Still, the town seemed to know, somehow. You could feel it in the way people lingered longer on her porch, in the way letters arrived without return addresses, filled with prayers written in uneven handwriting. The movement had long outgrown her. By now, the Ridgeway Pledge was taught in community groups and small churches across the country. In towns where people had forgotten how to trust one another, they read Laura's story and remembered. It wasn't about houses anymore. It was about people. Paying hospital bills, rebuilding barns after storms, buying groceries for neighbors without being asked. Silence had become a way of saying, "I see you, and I'm with you." One morning, a van from a film crew arrived at her gate. They wanted to make a documentary. Just an interview, the young producer promised, to show how it all began. Laura hesitated. I'm not sure I have much left to say. The producer smiled. Then maybe just say nothing. You're good at that. They set up in her kitchen, the same one where she'd once sat crying over a foreclosure letter. Cameras hummed quietly as sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. Mrs. Jensen, the interviewer began softly. When you look back now, what do you see? Laura thought for a long moment. I see noise, she said finally. A world full of people talking so loud they forgot to listen. And then I see one small town that remembered how to listen, with their hearts. The interviewer leaned forward. Do you think it changed anything? Laura smiled. Yes, not everything, but enough. The documentary aired 2 months later under the title The Quiet Revolution. It was streamed in classrooms, churches, even corporate offices. For a week, it seemed like the whole country was whispering. Messages flooded in. From families, teachers, soldiers, children. All telling her how they'd chosen to stay silent for someone else. She couldn't read them all, but she tried. And then one morning, she received a letter with no name, no return address, postmarked from New York City. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, You were right. Silence has consequences. So does love. Thank you. She knew who it was from. Thomas Leland, the man who'd once accused her of ruining him. She smiled through tears, folded the letter, and placed it inside the wooden box with all the others. Winter deepened. Her health worsened. By February, she rarely left her house. The doctor came twice a week, and Eddie stopped pretending not to worry. Rosa visited with soup and laughter. Pastor Grant prayed quietly by her bedside. One evening, snow began to fall thick, heavy flakes that blanketed everything in white. Laura sat by the window, bundled in a quilt, watching the light fade from the fields. Eddie sat beside her, hat in hand. You ever think about that day? He asked. Every day, she said softly. Not the silence itself, but what came after. How people looked at each other differently. He nodded. World's still talking about it, you know. There's even a group out east calling themselves the Silent Hands. They build houses for veterans. Don't ask for credit, don't take pictures. Just show up, work, and leave. Laura smiled faintly. That's the kind of noise I like. The next morning, she didn't wake up. The news spread slowly at first, then all at once, across Ridgeway, across Kansas, across the country. Radio stations played her interview again. Newspapers ran her photograph. That gentle smile, that light in her eyes. And then something remarkable happened. When the local radio announced the time of her memorial, an online post went viral. A simple message shared thousands of times. At noon this Sunday, wherever you are, take 1 minute of silence for Laura Jensen, the woman who taught us how to listen. No one organized it officially. No one had to. That Sunday, at exactly 12 o'clock, the world grew quiet. In Ridgeway, people gathered on Maple Creek Road, hats in hand, breath misting in the cold. In Topeka, traffic stopped. In a church in Oregon, the choir stood motionless mid-song. In a classroom in Georgia, a teacher lowered her chalk and bowed her head. Even in New York City, the noisiest place in America, something shifted. Cars paused at red lights longer than usual. A cab driver turned off his radio. A construction worker set down his drill and looked up at the sky. For 60 seconds, the world remembered what one small town had done. And in that vast, trembling silence, people felt connected again. Not by laws, not by words, but by something quieter and infinitely stronger. When the minute ended, there was no applause, no speeches. Just the sound of wind, of footsteps, of life continuing. Back in Ridgeway, Eddie stood by Laura's grave, his eyes red from the cold. Beside him, Rosa held a small child, her youngest, and Pastor Grant read a passage Laura had once written herself. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of love. It's the space between hearts where understanding grows. Eddie placed a single daisy on the grave. Rest easy, Laura, he whispered. We'll keep it going. And they did. Years passed. The Maple Creek Fund became a national foundation. The Ridgway Pledge was printed on posters in schools, community halls, and even courthouses. Every year on the first Sunday of March, towns across America held their own minute of silence. Not out of sorrow, but as a promise to remember what compassion sounds like when it doesn't need words. Children grew up hearing the story of the widow who bought her house for $1 and gave a nation back its conscience. Teachers told it as history. Preachers told it as parable. And in Ridgway, the old white house still stood, its porch newly painted, the swing rebuilt. Sometimes, travelers passing through would stop and take pictures, whispering to each other as if afraid to disturb the air. They'd look toward the hills, where the wind moved softly through the fields, and they'd swear they could hear something faint. Not a voice, not quite, but a feeling, like the memory of kindness carried on the breeze. Because some stories don't end. They just quiet down, waiting for the next person to listen. And somewhere, maybe far away, another knock would sound on another door. Someone would open it, afraid, holding a letter that might change their life. And perhaps, just perhaps, 50 neighbors would look at one another and remember Ridgway. They'd take a breath. They'd stay still. They'd stay silent. And love, steady, simple, unstoppable, would begin again. The road to Ridgway hadn't changed much in 20 years. Emily Jensen drove with the windows down, letting the spring wind tangle her hair. The field stretched wide and gold on both sides of the highway, and every few miles she passed an old farmhouse, a rusted mailbox, a memory she didn't quite remember but somehow still belonged to. She hadn't been back in almost a decade. Life had carried her elsewhere, to the city, to work, to noise. But something about the invitation she'd received last month had pulled her back. You are cordially invited to the dedication of the Laura Jensen Community Center. March 3rd. Ridgway, Kansas. March 3rd. The date still meant something. The anniversary of the silent auction. She smiled faintly at the thought. She was only a teenager when it happened, but she remembered flashes. Her mother crying at the kitchen table. Eddie standing guard like a stubborn guardian angel. And that strange day when people from all over town dressed their best just to sit in silence. The world had changed since then, yet the echoes of that moment were everywhere. In college, her professors talked about the silence movement as a case study in social ethics. In New York, she'd once walked past a mural that read, "Silence is love. Ridgway, Kansas, 2019. And now, all these years later, she was driving home to see the house again. The place where it all began. As she turned onto Maple Creek Road, her heart tightened. The white farmhouse still stood, its porch newly painted, wind chimes swaying in the breeze. The swing her father had built had been replaced, but it looked almost the same. A woman stood on the porch, gray hair, kind eyes, wearing an apron dusted with flour. When she saw Emily's car, she waved. "You must be Laura's girl," she said as Emily stepped out. "I'm Martha. My husband and I bought this place from the fund a few years back. But don't you worry, we've kept it just the way she liked it." Emily smiled, fighting back the emotion rising in her throat. "It looks beautiful." Martha nodded. "She's still here, you know. You can feel her, especially on quiet mornings." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and sunlight. The old wooden table still stood by the window, and on it sat a familiar wooden box. Martha noticed Emily looking at it. "Your mama kept that for years," she said. "Letters from people all over. When she passed, Eddie said it belonged to you." She opened the lid slowly. Inside were hundreds of envelopes, stacked neatly, edges yellowed with time. Some were addressed to Mrs. Jensen, Ridgway, Kansas. Others just said to the woman who stayed silent. Emily picked one at random and unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled like old leaves. "Dear Mrs. Jensen, I was at that auction in Brenton. I didn't know you, but your town changed me. I learned that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is nothing, and that nothing can change everything. Thank you." Her eyes blurred with tears. She closed the box gently, as if afraid the letters might blow away. That evening, she walked into town. Ridgway had grown, but not too much. There was a new coffee shop where the old hardware store used to be, and the diner now had a patio with string lights and music. But the people were the same, or maybe just their children, carrying the same warmth in their eyes. When she reached the community center, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors her mother would have called harvest gold. The building stood at the edge of town, simple and graceful, with big windows that reflected the fading light. A bronze plaque by the door read, "The Laura Jensen Community Center. For those who remember that love doesn't always speak." Inside, the hall was filled with people. Old faces, new faces, families, neighbors, children sitting cross-legged on the floor. Eddie was there too, older now, his hair white, his back a little bent. When he saw Emily, he smiled like he'd been waiting years for that moment. "Look at you," he said, hugging her tight. "You got your mama's eyes." She laughed softly. "And your stubbornness, I think." He chuckled. "Guilty." They found seats near the front as Pastor Grant, older too, though his voice still carried that same gentle authority, stepped to the podium. "Today marks 30 years since a small town remembered what community means," he began. "We gather not to mourn Laura Jensen, but to honor the silence she taught us to keep. The silence that listens, that protects, that loves." He gestured to a screen behind him. "Some of you remember that first auction. Others weren't born yet. But every one of us has been touched by what came from it." The lights dimmed, and a short film began to play. Images of Ridgeway through the years, of volunteers building homes, of farmers helping each other after storms, of children holding signs that read, "Silence Speaks." Then came footage of Laura, grainy, warm, her voice filling the room. Sometimes the most powerful sound is the one we choose not to make. Because silence doesn't mean we don't care. It means we care enough to listen. When the film ended, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The stillness said everything. After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing stories, laughter, hugs. Eddie took Emily's hand. "There's something I want to show you," he said. They walked outside, down a narrow path behind the community center, until they reached a small garden. At its center stood a statue, simple bronze, shaped like an open hand holding a single daisy. At the base, engraved in clean letters, were her mother's words, "Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything that matters." Emily touched the cold metal, tears catching in her lashes. "She really changed the world, didn't she?" Eddie nodded slowly. "She changed how it listens." They stood there in silence, the wind moving softly through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Emily sat alone on the steps of the community center. The stars were sharp and bright, just like they'd been in her childhood. She thought of her mother sitting on their old porch, whispering to the wind, and for the first time in years, she whispered back, "Thank you, Mom." The next morning, she packed the wooden box into her car. On her way out of town, she stopped at the edge of Maple Creek Road. The fields shimmered in the dawn light, endless and golden. She rolled down her window and listened. At first, there was nothing, just the hum of the earth waking up. But if you really listened, you could hear it. The faint echo of that long-ago silence, still alive, still moving through the world like a current beneath the noise. She smiled and said, "I hear you." Then she drove away, leaving the house, the fields, the town, but taking the silence with her, because that was the secret her mother had left behind. Silence was never the absence of sound. It was the continuation of love. It was the space between generations, between hearts, between homes, that held everything worth keeping. And somewhere, far down another road, another knock would sound on another door, and another small town would remember what Ridgeway taught the world. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is say nothing at all.